It was late in the afternoon when the sun began slipping behind the tall buildings at the edge of the town. The streets were turning quieter, and most people were heading home after a long day. On one of those streets, a man named Daniel drove his old car slowly, taking his time, not rushing anywhere. His car was worn out, the paint fading, the engine humming in a tired but steady way. He didn't mind. The car had taken him across many places in his life, and he felt safe in it. Daniel had planned to visit someone he had known long ago. It had been years since they spoke face to face, and he wanted to reconnect, even if just for a short conversation. He wasn't someone who liked drawing attention, so he kept his life quiet and simple. He wore plain clothes, carried only what he needed, and rarely spoke unless necessary. But despite all that calmness in him, the day was about to turn in a direction he didn't expect. As he drove past an intersection, flashing lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Daniel thought the police car was heading somewhere else, but then he noticed it was following directly behind him. He slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, wondering what could be wrong. His car was old, yes, but not unsafe. He hadn't broken any rules. Still, he stayed calm. He always believed that staying polite helped even in stressful moments. Two officers stepped out of the car. Their faces looked tense, and their steps were quick. One of them approached Daniel's window with a serious expression. "License and registration," the officer said sharply. Daniel nodded politely, handing over his documents without hesitation. He didn't argue or question their tone. He simply waited. The officer scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing for reasons Daniel couldn't understand. The second officer circled around the car, glancing through the windows as if searching for something hidden. "Where are you coming from?" the first officer asked. "Just driving through," Daniel replied in a calm voice. "Where are you headed?" "To visit an old friend," he answered. His answers were simple, honest, and clear. But somehow, the officers seemed more suspicious than before. They exchanged looks that Daniel couldn't read. He felt the tone of the situation change, coming heavier for reasons unknown to him. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer demanded. Daniel didn't ask why. He simply followed the instruction. He opened his door slowly and stepped out on the quiet street. A few people who were passing by slowed down as they noticed the flashing lights. Some even stopped in the distance, curious about what was happening. The second officer crossed his arms, watching Daniel closely, as if expecting him to make a sudden move. Daniel stood still, his hands at his sides, his face calm. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" one of them asked. "No," Daniel answered softly. "Anything illegal?" "No," he repeated. The officers didn't seem convinced. Instead of easing up, they continued pressing him with questions about where he had been, what he was doing in this area, and why he looked so nervous. Daniel hadn't felt nervous at first, but now anyone would. Still, he kept his voice gentle, giving the same polite reply every time. He didn't want to argue. He had learned long ago that calmness was better than reacting in frustration. The first officer walked to the back of the car and looked at the trunk. He didn't open it yet, but stared at it with suspicion. The second officer stood closer to Daniel. "You seem a bit too calm," the officer said in a low, almost accusing tone. Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. What was he supposed to do? Panic? Raise his voice? He simply looked down at the ground briefly before lifting his eyes again. "I'm just cooperating," he said. One of the officers scoffed under his breath. By now, a small crowd had gathered farther down the sidewalk. People whispered among themselves. Some held their phones. One young person even began recording, though from a safe distance. Daniel noticed but didn't show any reaction. He didn't want more attention than already placed on him. The officers' voices continued in harsh tones. They questioned him about his clothes, his car, why he was driving slowly, why he chose that route at that hour. Each question felt less like a genuine inquiry and more like an accusation. Still, Daniel didn't break his calm expression. After several minutes, one officer finally said, "We're going to search the car." Daniel nodded. "Go ahead." He didn't raise any objections. He had nothing to hide, though he did hope they would be careful. Some of the things in his car held deeper meaning than the officers could imagine. The search started. They looked through the glove compartment, under the seats, in the back pockets of the seats, and the small storage areas near the dashboard. They found nothing unusual, yet their suspicions still didn't fade. "Open the trunk," the officer ordered. Daniel reached for the keys, pausing for a moment. "Please handle the items gently," he said in a quiet tone. The officer frowned. "Why? What's in there?" "Just personal things," Daniel replied. The officer didn't appreciate the request. "We'll decide what's important," he said coldly. Daniel stepped back, avoiding further argument as the trunk opened. Inside were ordinary things like an old backpack, a small toolkit, and a sealed metal case placed neatly in the corner. The metal case was scratched and a bit heavy, but locked shut. The moment the officers saw it, both of them paused. Their eyes locked onto it with a kind of alertness Daniel hadn't seen earlier. "What is that?" one officer asked. "It's personal," Daniel answered softly. "That's not good enough." "Unlock it." Daniel hesitated, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he hoped they wouldn't treat the content carelessly. But he had no choice. The officers were already growing impatient. He stepped closer and unlatched the case. Inside, the officers found old documents, neatly folded papers, and medals placed carefully in small compartments. The medals were worn, their edges dull, but still carrying a sense of deep history. The documents had seals and signatures that weren't familiar to the officers. There were identity cards that looked official, yet different from anything they had seen. The officers stared at the items with blank expressions mixed with confusion. "What is all this?" the officer asked, the harshness in his voice fading. "Just things from my past." Daniel replied. That answer only deepened their suspicion, but not in the same way as before. Now they were confused, maybe even uncertain. But instead of calming down, the officers took it as a reason to dig deeper. "We need to verify all this," one officer said. Daniel stayed silent. He didn't argue. He simply closed the case gently and stepped back. While they waited for confirmation from their department, the street felt strangely quiet. A few whispers floated through the air as the small crowd watched from afar. The recording continued. The tension grew heavier, but shifted into a different kind of feeling. One that even the officers couldn't quite describe. One of the officers finally looked at Daniel and asked, "Why are you carrying all these things around?" Daniel paused, looking at the trunk, then at the officer. "They're part of my life," he said softly. Nothing more. His tone wasn't defensive. It was gentle, almost humble. His eyes held a mix of memories, experiences, and silent stories he never planned to share. The officers didn't know how to respond. They stood there, unsure if they were dealing with someone dangerous or someone they had completely misunderstood. The pause in the moment said more than words. Somewhere in that silence it became clear. This wasn't an ordinary stop. Daniel wasn't an ordinary man. And the officers had no idea how wrong their assumptions might be. They waited for the supervisor to arrive, unaware that what they would learn next would change the entire direction of the evening and their own. Understanding of the man standing quietly before them, the air around. The quiet street grew heavier as the minutes passed. Daniel stood near his old car, his hands resting calmly by his sides, trying not to let the tension show on his face. He had been in difficult situations before, far more intense than this one. But the weight of being misunderstood still pressed on him. Something in the way the officers had spoken, something in the way they looked at him, reminded him of moments he thought he had left far behind. But this time, he wasn't in a remote land or a hidden mission. He was just a man standing on the side of the road in a normal town. Surrounded by strangers who had no idea who he was or what he carried quietly within him, the two officers stood a few feet away, trying to look confident, but the sight of the metal case had changed their expressions. The harshness in their voices had softened a little, replaced by something else: uncertainty, maybe even unease. They continued examining the medals, the papers, and the old identification cards that didn't match anything they were used to seeing day to day. Why would anyone carry all this around? One of them whispered to the other. Daniel heard them, but he acted as if he hadn't. He simply looked off at the fading sunlight, letting the warmth touch his face. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to continue his quiet journey, meet an old friend, and move on before night settled. Still, the situation had grown bigger than he expected. The young person who had begun recording earlier was now joined by two others. They weren't close enough to interrupt, but close enough to see. The flashing lights made the scene look far more dramatic than it was. For Daniel, everything felt slower, as if every second stretched out. The first officer cleared his throat and finally approached him again. "Look," he said. "Trying to sound firm? We're waiting for our supervisor to get here. Until then, we're going to need you to stay right where you are." Daniel nodded. "I understand you." The officer snapped lightly, though the tone wasn't as sharp as before, because most people wouldn't stay this calm. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Being angry doesn't make situations better. The officer didn't have a reply for that. He simply turned away and pretended to check something on his radio. The second officer, a little younger and more expressive, kept staring at Daniel with confused eyes, as if there was something about him that didn't fit the image they had formed earlier, something that no amount of suspicion could explain. He finally stepped closer. "What exactly were you planning to do tonight?" he asked. "Just visit someone I knew a long time ago," Daniel said. "Where do they live?" "Not far from here." "You haven't seen them in years?" "No," Daniel answered. Life moved fast. People move apart even when they don't mean to. The officer seemed to consider that. Then he asked, "Why carry medals and old documents?" "Most people don't walk around with things like that." Daniel breathed in slowly before responding. "I was going to give something back," he said quietly. "Something that belonged to my friend." The officer's eyebrows dipped. "What kind of something?" "Something personal." The officer pressed his lips together, not sure how to respond. There was something unusual about Daniel's words. Not suspicious, but heavy with meaning. The kind of meaning that you didn't question unless you were ready to hear the full story. The street traffic had slowed even more now, several people glancing over as they passed by. Some seemed sympathetic, others just curious. A few murmured among themselves, wondering why the officers were treating a calm, quiet man so harshly. But no one stepped closer, and Daniel didn't expect them to. He wasn't the type to draw support from strangers. The minutes continued to stretch. The first officer finally radioed in again, pacing slowly near the sidewalk while the second officer watched the metal case. It was as if the case itself had become the center of everything. The quiet metal box that held memories from a past Daniel rarely spoke about. "Do you know how old these papers are?" the younger officer asked suddenly, lifting one carefully. "They're from many years ago," Daniel said. "Are they real?" Daniel looked at him softly. "They are, the medals. They look old." "They are old," he answered. "Older than most things I've kept." The officer paused again. His eyes went to the medals, then to Daniel, and back to the medals. "You don't seem like someone who would carry important things around in an old car," he said honestly. Daniel let out a small laugh, calm, soft, and almost sad. "Life doesn't always give us the things we think we deserve," he said. "And sometimes it gives us things we don't expect. I don't need much now. Just a simple ride and a peaceful day." The officer didn't know how to respond to that either. A few more minutes passed, and the radio finally crackled with static before a voice spoke through it. "Supervisor is on the way. 8 to 5 minutes." The older officer nodded and glanced toward Daniel, who remained still, his hands at his sides. "You sure you don't want to sit?" the younger officer asked at last, noticing how long Daniel had been standing. "I'm fine," Daniel said gently. "You don't look uncomfortable at all," the officer remarked. "I've been in worse situations," Daniel replied. That statement caught both officers off guard. The older one turned around sharply. "What do you mean?" he asked. Daniel shrugged a little. "Just what I said." The officers exchanged a look. It wasn't suspicion this time. It was curiosity. Before they could ask more, the radio crackled again. signaling that the supervisor had arrived. A dark SUV turned the corner and pulled up behind the patrol car. The lights flashed for a moment before turning off. The supervisor stepped out slowly. He was calm, composed, and carried an air of someone who had seen his fair share of stressful moments. He approached the officers first, and they explained everything: the stop, the search, the metal case. The strange documents. The supervisor listened quietly, glancing occasionally toward Daniel and the open trunk. Then he walked toward Daniel. "You're Daniel?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel answered. "I'm told you have some documents and medals in that case. May I take a look?" "Of course," Daniel replied without hesitation. The supervisor approached the trunk, leaned down, and examined the contents. He picked up the medals first, turning them gently in his hand. His expression changed almost instantly. The hardness in his face faded, replaced with something else: recognition. He looked through the papers next. The seals, the signatures, the stamps, the dates. Then he stood still, very still. The two officers watched closely. The supervisor took a slow breath, closed the folder carefully, and turned toward Daniel with an expression neither officer had seen on him before. "You served," the supervisor said softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply nodded. "Not just served," the supervisor continued. "You were part of something significant." Daniel looked down briefly, then lifted his eyes again. "That was a long time ago." The supervisor nodded slowly, almost respectfully. The officers looked confused. They glanced at each other, then at the supervisor. Unsure what they were supposed to understand, the supervisor placed the documents back inside the case gently, almost with care. Then he turned to the officers. "We need to talk," he said in a low, serious voice. Both officers stiffened. The supervisor didn't raise his voice or express anger, but the weight of his words was enough. He motioned for the officers to step aside with him. They walked a few feet away, and though the voices were hushed, Daniel could still sense the shift in the air. A few moments later, the younger officer's eyes widened. The older officer swallowed hard. Whatever the supervisor told them, it changed everything. Their expressions softened, their postures straightened, and their eyes went back to Daniel, no longer filled with suspicion, but something closer to disbelief. The small crowd nearby noticed the shift too. People leaned in a little more, curious about what was unfolding. The supervisor returned to Daniel. "Thank you for your patience," said gently. Daniel nodded. "I understand. You're just doing your job." The supervisor gave a small, sincere smile. "Even then, this shouldn't have gone the way it did." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The officers approached him next. Their faces were different, now's harsh, more human. But even then, even as they stood in front of him, they didn't know the full story. They knew only enough to realize how deeply they had judged him, and the night was far from over. The truth about Daniel's past, the one he never intended to show, was only beginning to rise to the surface. In the next moments, the officers would learn that the quiet man they pulled over wasn't just someone with old medals or faded documents. He was someone whose life had been shaped by experiences they couldn't imagine. Someone who had walked through places they might never hear about. But for now, he stood quietly beside his old car, waiting for whatever came next, hoping the evening wouldn't grow larger or heavier than it's already had. The street felt strangely quiet after the supervisor stepped aside with the two officers. Even though cars continued to pass in the distance and people walked along the sidewalks, the world around Daniel felt like it had slowed to a gentle, uneasy pause. A few murmurs floated in the air from the small crowd watching, but most people kept their distance. Unsure of what was unfolding, Daniel stood near the open trunk of his old car, the metal case still resting exactly where he had placed it years ago. He never imagined it would end up displayed like this, under flashing police lights, surrounded by strangers who had no idea how much weight that old case carried. The supervisor walked back toward,
Daniel.
with a calmer expression than before. There was no tension in his face now, only understanding, maybe even respect. "You've been patient," the supervisor said quietly. Daniel nodded, but he didn't smile. I don't want trouble. You haven't caused any, the supervisor replied. This situation simply grew bigger than it needed to. Daniel looked down for a moment. He wasn't angry, just tired. The kind of tired that didn't show in the body, but lived deep inside someone who had already lived many lives. The officers slowly approached him too. Their expressions were different from earlier, no harshness, no raised voices. They stood still for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Sir? The younger officer began, but his voice faltered slightly, we didn't realize. Daniel gently lifted his hand to stop him. It's fine. The officer looked relieved, but still uneasy. We misjudged you, he added softly. Daniel didn't respond. He simply looked at them with calm eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen more than anyone around him could guess. The supervisor turned his attention to the medals in the case. He picked up one gently, the way someone picks up something priceless. These aren't ordinary, the supervisor said. Most people never see medals like this in their lifetime. And the documents. He paused thoughtfully. Let's just say they don't belong to the kind of missions most people know about. The crowd leaned in a little. Though they couldn't hear everything, the younger officer looked between the supervisor and Daniel. So he's actually... The supervisor gave a small nod. Yes. Daniel didn't react to any of it. He didn't puff his chest, didn't look proud, didn't even seem pleased that the truth was coming out. If anything, his shoulders lowered slightly, as if the attention was something he hoped would fade quickly. I wasn't trying to hide anything, Daniel said softly, but I also wasn't trying to reveal anything. The supervisor nodded. A past like yours. It's not something you brag about. I understand. The younger officer swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Daniel gave a quiet sigh. Would you have listened? The question settled over the officers like a weight they didn't know how to lift. The older officer stepped forward. We shouldn't have spoken to you the way we did, he admitted. We were too quick to assume. Daniel looked at him gently. People assume things. It happens. That answer made the officer lower his eyes. He seemed embarrassed by how calm Daniel was. Even after being treated unfairly, a few people from the crowd whispered louder now, recognizing that something unusual was happening. Some believed Daniel had been mistreated. Others wondered if the officers had stumbled onto something far more complex than a simple traffic stop. The supervisor cleared his throat softly. Daniel, the documents you're carrying, some of them would normally require restricted verification. I want you to know I've spoken to the department, and everything checks out. Daniel nodded. Good. But I do have a question, the supervisor continued. Why now? Why today? Why carry them with you? Daniel hesitated. It was a long, quiet pause, the kind that made the air feel heavier. I told the officer earlier, he said slowly. I was going to return something to someone. The supervisor studied him. Something connected to all this? Very much connected, Daniel said. The younger officer stepped closer. Is it dangerous? Daniel shook his head gently. No, nothing dangerous. Just something meaningful. The officers exchanged confused looks, but they didn't press him. The supervisor seemed to understand that some stories didn't need to be dug out. They came out when the time was right. The supervisor closed the metal case with care. Would you like me to lock this for you? Daniel nodded once. Thank you. You didn't expect kindness. So when it showed up, he accepted it lightly. The supervisor locked the case and returned the keys to Daniel. There was a moment of silence before the supervisor spoke again. You've served this country in ways most people can't imagine, he said quietly. We owe you more than an apology. Daniel's eyes softened. Service was a choice I made a long time ago. I don't expect anything now. Supervisor looked down respectfully. Well, even if you don't expect it, you deserve respect. The younger officer stepped forward again. Can I ask something? Daniel nodded. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, the younger officer added carefully. But were you in the kind of missions that, people don't talk about? Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said simply. That one word hit the officer harder than anything else tonight. It wasn't said with pride or with mystery. It was said the way someone talks about a memory that carries its own gravity. The officer nodded slowly. I figured. They stood there quietly until the supervisor turned toward the crowd. He lifted his hand politely and said, "Everything is fine here. Please continue on." Most of the crowd began to disperse. A few lingered a little longer, but nothing dramatic held their attention anymore. The flashing lights switched off, and the street returned to its usual evening calm. But Daniel could still feel the shift inside the officers. Something had changed, not just their understanding of him, but their understanding of how quickly assumptions can lead people down the wrong path. The older officer looked at Daniel again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Truly?" Daniel met his eyes. "I accept your apology. It shouldn't have reached this point." "Maybe," Daniel said softly, "but sometimes things happen for reasons we don't see right away." The younger officer stepped forward. "If you don't mind me asking, did you ever think about telling anyone about what you went through? What you did?" Daniel shook his head gently. "Stories like that aren't meant for everyone. They belong to the people who lived them. And even then, sometimes it's better to keep them folded away in a quiet place." The officer nodded, understanding slowly. The supervisor placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder lightly, respectfully. "If you ever need anything from this department," he said firmly, "you come straight here. You've earned that right." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He carefully lifted the metal case from the trunk and placed it back exactly where it had been before the officers opened it. He closed the trunk gently, the old hinges creaking softly. The night breeze grew cooler as the last bit of daylight faded. The streetlights flickered on one by one. Daniel stepped back toward the driver's door of his car. But before he opened it, the younger officer spoke again. "Can I ask just one more thing?" Daniel turned slightly and waited. "When you said earlier you've been in worse situations, was that an understatement?" Daniel looked at him with quiet eyes that held more experience than anyone his age should ever carry. "Yes," he said softly. "A very big one." The officer swallowed and nodded, realizing he had been speaking to someone who had walked through places far beyond anything he could. Imagine Daniel opened the driver's door. "Have a good evening," he said. "You too, sir," the supervisor replied. The officers echoed the same words softly. Daniel settled into his seat, closed the door, and for a moment he simply sat there. Not to collect himself, not to calm down, but to let the world grow quiet again. He took a slow breath, started the engine, and drove off into the dimming street. The officers watched him go, the red taillights fading into the distance. They stood there long after his car turned the corner. Something about that moment stayed with them, a lesson they didn't plan for, but one they knew they needed. The moment the patrol car reached the small district station, the man felt the same uneasy weight settle over him again. He had been through long nights, rough weather, and dangerous places during his years of service, but this was a different kind of discomfort. This was the kind that came from being misunderstood, judged too quickly, and spoken to like someone who didn't matter. He stayed quiet as they opened the door and told him to step out. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply walked inside, hoping the day would move towards some kind of truth. Inside the station, everything felt loud. Phones rang, printers hummed, people talked over each other. The officers walked him to a bench and told him to sit. He did. He looked around the room, noticing every detail, but showing no reaction. A young officer stood near him holding a clipboard, tapping his pen on it as if unsure what to do next. The man noticed the officer's nervous hands but said nothing. One of the older officers came forward and asked his name. The man gave it calmly and without hesitation. Then they asked where he had been earlier, why he had walked out of the store looking frustrated, why he ended up sitting outside alone. He answered each question straight, simple, and quiet. Still, the officers didn't look convinced. They exchanged glances as if trying to read something hidden in his face. The man remained steady, speaking only when asked, and never raising his tone. He knew there was no point in arguing. He had lived long enough to understand that some moments only revealed their meaning with time. A supervisor stepped out from a back room, a tall man with a serious expression. He walked over and looked at the man in a way that felt different from the others. Not softer, not kinder, but more observant. as if he was trying to listen beneath the man's silence. He asked a few questions, but each one seemed aimed not at catching the man in a lie, but understanding what really happened. Still, the day moved slowly. Every minute felt stretched, as if the world outside had paused just to make this moment heavier. The man didn't complain. He waited. He watched the officers do their work. He noticed small things. One officer struggling with a jammed printer, another trying to calm a worried mother on the phone, another rushing by with paperwork stacked so high it nearly hit his face. The man wondered if any of them felt overwhelmed. He wondered if they could sense the weight he carried, years of service. Years of discipline, years of learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. At one point, a younger officer walked over, clearly frustrated by the slow process. "Look, sir," the officer said, "we just need to know why the store manager panicked enough to call us. He said you refused to leave and looked like you were hiding something." The man looked up at him. "I wasn't hiding anything," he replied softly. "I only wanted to pay for something. They thought I had picked something up without permission." I tried explaining, but no one wanted to listen. The younger officer frowned. "Well, people get nervous these days." The man nodded. "I understand that. But it doesn't make it fair." The officer didn't have an answer. He simply walked away, leaving the man sitting quietly again. The hours passed in a slow rhythm. People came and went. Officers changed shifts. The man remained where he was, waiting for someone to finally see the truth. But he didn't show anger or impatience. He kept his posture straight and calm, his hands on his lap, his breathing steady. At one point, a new officer entered the station carrying a stack of filed reports. As soon as he saw the man sitting on the bench, his expression changed, almost like he recognized something familiar. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched the man for a moment, trying to remember what it was. Then, suddenly, he stepped closer and asked the supervisor quietly, "What's he here for?" The supervisor explained the situation in a few lines. Nothing dramatic, just a misunderstanding. But the store's panic had forced them to investigate it properly. The new officer's eyes stayed on the man.
Did he give you his full name?
"Yes," the supervisor said. "We've already noted it down." The new officer nodded slowly. "May I see the form?" The supervisor handed him the clipboard. The officer scanned it quickly, and then his eyes widened just a little. Not in shock, not in fear, more like recognition. He looked at the man again, this time with a deeper stare, as if a memory from years ago had suddenly connected. The supervisor noticed. "You know him?" The new officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked closer to the man and stopped in front of him. "Sir, may I ask something? Were you once stationed overseas?" "Many years back." The man looked up calmly. "Yes. Did you also serve in a special operations unit?" The officer continued, his voice quieter now. The man nodded again. "Yes." He didn't elaborate. He never did. The officer took a slow breath. "I thought so. I recognized you. I've seen your name before in training courses, older reports, and stories that people still talk about." The room suddenly felt different. The officers who were standing nearby paused their work, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Even the supervisor leaned in slightly as if he had just realized something important was unfolding. The man did not react. He simply sat still, as he always did, when his past was mentioned. Not proudly, not defensively, just neutral, as though those years belonged to someone else. "Why didn't you say anything?" The officer asked, his voice filled with genuine confusion. The man looked at him gently. "Because no one asked. And because it doesn't define who I am today." The officer swallowed hard. He turned to the supervisor. "Sir, I think you should run his name through the records again. Not the local ones, the national ones." "Why?" the supervisor asked. "Because he's not just any veteran. You'll see." The room grew quieter. The shift in energy was subtle but undeniable. Officers who had earlier been skeptical now watched with growing curiosity. Some weren't even sure why they felt the change, but they sensed it. The supervisor took the clipboard back and walked into the office, closing the door behind him. Everyone waited, even the man. He didn't move, but there was a different air about him now. Not pride, just an old weight returning for a moment. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The supervisor didn't come out. The new officer stood near the man, as if silently offering support, though the man didn't seem to need any. After a while, the younger officer, who had spoken rudely earlier, slowly approached again. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he could feel the atmosphere shifting. "Sir," the young officer said quietly. "I didn't know." The man nodded. "Most people don't, and that's all right. I shouldn't have assumed things." The man gave him a calm look. "It happens. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to be better." The young officer lowered his eyes, embarrassed but grateful for the man's kindness. Finally, the office door opened. The supervisor stepped out with a completely changed expression. He didn't look suspicious anymore. He didn't look doubtful. He looked stunned, almost humbled. He walked straight to the man and spoke in a voice that carried both respect and disbelief. "Sir, I think we need to talk privately. There are things in your file that none of us expected to see." The station fell silent. The man stood slowly, not with pride or excitement, but with the same simple calm he had shown all day. "Of course," he said. "I can talk." He followed the supervisor to the back office, leaving the other officers watching in awe, confusion, and a growing sense of guilt, because now they were beginning to understand. The man they had treated unfairly all morning was someone they should have listened to. From the start, someone who had a past none of them were prepared for. And as the office door closed behind him, every officer in the room felt the same quiet realization settling over them. This man was not who they thought he was, and the truth was only beginning to unfold. The supervisor closed the office door gently, almost as if he didn't want the sound to disturb the heavy silence that had filled the station. He gestured for the man to sit, and the man took a seat without hesitation. The office was small, crowded with files stacked against the walls and a computer that hummed quietly in the corner. A single window let in a soft strip of light that fell across the desk. The supervisor sat down slowly, as if his mind was still trying to catch up with what he had just read. He looked at the man with a mix of respect and confusion. For several seconds, he didn't speak at all. He was choosing his words carefully now, something he clearly should have done earlier. I didn't realize who you were," he finally said. The man nodded. "It's all right. You weren't supposed to." The supervisor swallowed. "But your record. It's not normal. It's not like anything I've ever seen. You served for many years. You were part of units that don't even exist on regular lists. There are commendations, notes, things that I'm not even allowed to open fully." The man didn't look proud. If anything, he looked tired. "It was a long time ago. Why didn't you tell us?" The supervisor asked. "For what?" The man replied softly. "To impress you? To stop you from asking questions? A person shouldn't need a title or a background for people to treat him fairly." The supervisor exhaled slowly. He felt the weight of those words. "You're right. We should have handled this better. Much better." The man didn't answer, but his silence wasn't angry. It was simply honest. The supervisor leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "The store manager made a complaint that suggested you were suspicious. We only responded to that. But after reading your file, you shouldn't even have been brought here like this." He paused. "Honestly, someone with your background should be earning the highest level of respect." The man shook his head gently. "Respect shouldn't depend on a background either." Supervisor nodded again, ashamed. "I understand," hesitated before asking the next question. "There's something else in your record? Something about you leaving service after an incident overseas? It's marked confidential." The man looked down at his hands for a moment. "Some things are better left where they happened." The supervisor respected that and didn't push further. He straightened up. "Well, you're free to go, sir. There's no reason for you to remain here any longer. We'll also be speaking to the store about their behavior." The man stood slowly. "Thank you," the supervisor stopped him. "Before you leave, would you allow me to tell the officers who you really are? They're feeling terrible outside. They assume too much. I think it will teach them something meaningful. The man thought about it. If it helps them grow, then all right. But don't make it dramatic. Just honesty is enough. The supervisor smiled faintly. Of course. They walked out of the office together. When the other officers saw the man step out, they all stood without being told. It wasn't planned, it was instinctive. The room felt different now, as though the man carried an invisible presence that had always been there, but had just been revealed. The supervisor cleared his throat. Everyone, he said, I want you to know something important. We made mistakes today. We treated this man unfairly based on assumptions. But what most of you didn't know is that he has served this country in ways that few people ever have. The younger officers exchanged looks, surprised, embarrassed, and unsure how to respond. He didn't just serve, the supervisor continued. He protected lives, helped civilians, and completed missions that most of us would find impossible even to imagine. His record is one of the most distinguished I've seen in my career. Man stood quietly as the room processed the truth. One of the officers finally stepped forward, the same young one who had spoken sharply to him earlier. Sir, he said, his voice trembling slightly, I'm truly sorry for how I treated you today. I shouldn't have talked to you like that. You didn't deserve it. The man placed a gentle hand on the officer's shoulder. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. The officer nodded, relief washing over his face. Another officer stepped forward next. If you ever need anything, from any of us, please know that we're here. The man smiled faintly. Thank you. But I'm all right. The third officer, one who had barely spoken earlier, stepped forward quietly. Sir, he said, is it true that you once saved an entire convoy during a storm overseas? The man chuckled softly. Stories tend to grow legs. It wasn't just me. No one does anything alone. Few of the officers exchanged looks, impressed, but also moved by his humility. Eventually, the supervisor walked him outside. The sunlight had softened by then, casting a warm glow across the parking lot. The air felt lighter than the air inside. Do you have a ride? The supervisor asked. I'll walk, the man replied calmly. It's a long way back to the store area. I don't mind. I've walked longer. Supervisor gave a small nod of respect. If you ever feel the need to talk about anything, or if you ever want to share your story, please know the door is open. The man smiled gently. Some stories are meant to stay quiet. But thank you. Started walking away, his steps steady and unhurried. But as he reached the end of the parking lot, he heard someone calling behind him. It was the new officer, the one who had recognized him, sir. Wait. The man stopped and turned. The officer jogged over, slightly out of breath. I'm sorry, I wanted to say something. The man waited. You don't know this, the officer said, but I studied some of your missions during my training. Not the full details, but enough to understand the kind of bravery you showed. People talked about you like you were someone impossible to replace. And today, seeing you treated like this, seeing you remain calm and respectful, even when we weren't, it teaches us more than any training could. The man listened quietly, his expression kind. I just wanted you to know. The officer said softly that you're still making an impact, even if you don't try to. The man placed a hand on the officer's arm, steady, warm, reassuring. Thank you. But remember, it's not about what I did before. It's about who we are now. That's what we carry forward. The officer nodded. Deeply moved, the man turned again and continued walking down the quiet road that led away from the station. The sun painted long shadows behind him, and the breeze carried the soft sounds of the town moving on with its day. He walked without hurry, without bitterness, and without any desire to prove himself. The truth had come out, but he didn't cling to it. His past was only a part of his story, not his identity. What mattered more was the present moment, a walk in the warm afternoon light, a reminder that respect should be given to all, and a quiet hope that the officers inside that station would treat the next person a little better. As he moved farther away, the officers stood outside watching him going, not because he was a hero from the past, but because he had shown them what dignity looked like in the present. The man kept walking, steady and calm, heading toward whatever tomorrow would bring. and behind him, a group of officers carried a new understanding when they would remember for a long time.